Okay, so we are here today for the AP Computer Science A um, test webinar. I am Kira Brownell. I've worked with ESM for over 6 years. I've tutored computer science all 6 years. And so I've worked through this test a lot and seen what strategies work and what don't work. And so if you have any questions as we're going, type them in the Q&A and I will get to them. It's gonna be fairly small size, so any individualized questions are fine as well. They don't have to be generalized. Okay. So the test date is May 4th and it is at noon wherever you are. So if you're on the East Coast, it's at noon. West Coast, you're at noon. So May 4th is our computer science A test date. Just FYI, this is not talking about computer science principles. That's a totally different test, totally different class. So this is the Java class, computer science A. The test format, it's broken up into 2 sections. Both are an hour and a half long. And the first section you'll take is the multiple choice. It has 40 questions and you get an hour and a half for it. And it's worth 50% of your grade. So it's not an uneven scale. Your multiple choice is worth just as much as your free response. So you should definitely be practicing both an equal amount. And then the second section is your free response. It's a total of 4 questions, but each question can have multiple parts. And again, you also get an hour and a half, and it is 50% of your exam grade. A little bit about the multiple choice. It covers all 10 units. So your teacher should be going through each of the units, making sure you know the vocabulary for them, making sure you cover all the different concepts. So starting at the beginning with variables and how to just create general methods and return statements, stuff like that. And then all the way to the end with array lists and their methods, their string methods, the double arrays, anything like that. The majority of your multiple choice questions are going to be on units 3, 4, and 6, which are your Boolean expressions. So those if statements, what could go in there, any iterations. So for loops, working through an array, working through the characters in a string, any sort of iteration, and then of course arrays. So multiple choice questions, they tend to be either logic based or which code is going to be the correct code, what is the error in the code, or just what is this specific definition for a vocabulary word. If you haven't started working through multiple choice questions, you should definitely practice because they are trick questions and they do take a lot of time to get used to how they word things. Okay. Here's the breakdown of the types of multiple choice questions. So of course they cover all 10 units, but each unit will also have some of these types. So program design and algorithm development, that's basically asking questions on which type of code is going to accomplish what you need. It's also going to ask questions about like syntax and making sure that you're able to find any syntax errors or making sure that you understand how to initialize certain variables or objects. Then code logic is going to be walking through if else statements, walking through for loops for each and while loops. Code logic, it's going to be a lot of out of these 3 options, which ones will accomplish the goal? And you'll have to work through and write out how you iterate between them and figure out what differences there are and choose that way. And then code testing, that's finding any errors, noticing those syntax mistakes and figuring out how you would have to fix them. Code testing is also If the error is with a for loop, maybe you're going one loop too many, maybe you get an out of bounds error on an array list. That's all the code testing, paying very close attention to the code they give you and making sure it's accurate. And then documentation, that's more of your vocabulary. It's not necessarily code-based, but it's more of the conceptual side of things. Most of your multiple choice questions are going to be individual, but there will be a couple sets or groups of questions that are focused on the same code block. So for an example like that, they'll give you a code block, probably with a couple methods or maybe even an entire class, and there'll maybe be 2 to 3 multiple choice questions on that specific code block. And it could be any type of these questions. It doesn't have to just be code logic or just be the program design. So pay attention. If it says this code is for the next 5 questions or next 3 questions, make sure you're recognizing that and you're not getting lost or confused on what to look at. Okay, free response overview. So this is the type of question that your teachers focus on the most. At least the teachers that I've worked with, they do a lot of free response and they do a lot of just programs in general. So you should be getting a lot of practice with free response, but it is different when you're typing it on a computer versus handwriting it. On the AP test, you guys will be handwriting. And so you need to get used to checking your own work for errors and not relying on the computer to tell you if there is a runtime error or a syntax error, anything like that. The free response questions, there are 4 of them. And again, you get an hour and a half on them. These 4 questions will have multiple parts, and they cover writing methods, writing classes, iterating through arrays and array lists, and then iterating through 2D arrays and manipulating those arrays and array lists. This is all handwritten code, and each question, it's graded based off of a breakdown. So every question is worth X amount of points, and the grader has to check for certain items in it. So it'll say, is there an if statement? Is there a for loop that iterates correctly? Is there a call to this specific method? If a question tells you to use a method given, you have to use it or else you will lose those points. So a good way to practice these free response questions is to find a website, which I have some at the end of this, that has a bunch of examples and then also has the scoring breakdown. And then you can practice checking which pieces of the points did you get and which did you forget or not get into your code. Okay, types of free response questions. So obviously there's 4 of them and they talk about each of these items, but each question is specific. So the first question will talk about methods and control structures, which basically means, can you create the objects of a given class and then utilize those methods? We should be paying attention to keywords here like private, public, if there's a return type, if there are parameters being sent in. We need to pay attention to the given instructions and make sure we are utilizing everything given to us. These methods will also use if, for loops, while loops, stuff like that. The next question is going to be about creating a class. A lot of the time, this will be a superclass or a subclass of something else, and they'll give you what the superclass is, and you have to make sure you put extends blank class. So memorizing those keywords, when you see it say like this class is a type of another class, you want to use extends in your class title. So this question's all about creating the new class and writing the methods that the new class needs. So that includes the constructor. We don't want to forget to implement a constructor. In the constructor, you're allowed to call super and utilize the super's constructor. Just be super careful, make sure there's not extra parameters that need to be defined or initialized. Question 3 is on arrays and array lists. So arrays, of course, have a totally different like initialization process than array lists. So making sure you know the different methods, the different variables that go along with each. You do get a like method sheet or like your Java database of all the different methods that you should know, and it'll tell you like hints and stuff for what they do. But you should try to memorize them, because looking back at that sheet will take time away from actually writing and figuring out the algorithm needed. So this array and array list, it's a 1D array, and you'll have to iterate through them and traverse all the items or manipulate the items in some way. And then the fourth and final free response question is a 2D array, which is very similar to the 1D array question or the array list question, but now it's of course 2D arrays. So they want to see the nested for loops. They want to see how you are going to access each individual piece in the 2D array. Again, it could be to create, traverse, and manipulate the elements in the array. So making sure you know the specific ways to do that. Okay, so here's an example multiple choice question. We can just kind of walk through this one so you can see. This is basically just figuring out what is the code doing. This is one of those program design questions where they just want to see, can you figure out what would be printed out or what would be accomplished by this code? So public class thing 1, so we're creating a thing 1, public void calc, and it has a method calc that takes in a number. N star equals 3, so that's multiplication, right? You take the number that's currently being sent in and multiply it by 3 and set it to that, and then it'll print out that new number. And then we have a secondary class, thing 2 extends thing 1, and again it takes in a number, but now it's going to add 2 to that number and then call the superclasses method and multiply by 3. So let's say we send in 3, we add 2 to it, it becomes 5. Then we call the superclass and we'll do 5 times 3 and we get 15, and it'll print out 15. Then we get to the actual question. So all that is just reading through what they're giving us, trying to figure out what information the computer has and what information it's going to return to the user. So the input and the output of the program. Now it's asking us if we define thing 1t equals a new thing 2. And this is allowed because thing 2 is of the type thing 1. Right? And so we can set t equal to a new thing 2. And then we call calc of 2, and it's asking what's printed out. So these questions are a lot of the test, and we want to make sure that we understand the minute changes or differences, because some of them might not have only numbers written, but it might say this would give an error. And you need to then know, is this even allowed? Can I say thing 1t equals thing 2? And so if it does say this is an error, you need to be very aware of all those superclass subclass rules and which method would actually be called, or if it wouldn't be called at all. Another type of question is understanding the logic behind a program and figuring out the reasons why something would or would not work. How I like to do these is I read the question and it is asking what explains why the code segment does not work. I won't read the answer choices just yet. I'll go to the code segment and try and figure out what's wrong myself. And once you walk through that code segment, come up with your own answer. What did go wrong and why isn't this code working as we need it to? And then best match your answer with one of their given answers. If you can't figure out what is wrong with the code, then of course use the answer options to try and figure out which one best matches what's wrong. Okay. And then another type of example, we're not going to hit all the types of questions, but this is one where they give you options for what should be written in, and there might be stars where it says like more code, and then it says like where should these be placed, or which one would best replace this place where it says more code. If you get to a question like this, you have to walk through and figure out what's the difference between all of them. Like 1 in this case has a while loop, whereas 2 has a for loop. Do they still loop through the same amount of elements, and are we still able to manipulate the elements in the same way? 3 is a for each loop. Not a lot of students like for each loops, so make sure you review that topic before the AP test, because I'm like that too. I don't really enjoy for each loops. I use for loops a lot. And so when I get to a for each, I have to remind myself you're not able to manipulate the data, you're only able to read the data. So that's kind of how we would work through these. Make sure you start at the same point, like k equals 0, k equals 0. Make sure we iterate for while loops, right? While loops don't automatically iterate, so you have to make sure that they have an iteration in there. Versus for loops, they do. At the end, you have that k plus plus. So we need to just make sure we're paying attention for all the minute differences between whiles, fors, and for eaches. And then, of course, once you eliminate one, so let's say this first one doesn't work, we could cross off B, C, and E, and we'd be choosing between A and D. And so that would be a good one to check first, because 1 is in 3 answer options. If you prove it is incorrect, you are then down to a 50-50 chance. And guessing's allowed on this test. So it's a really good idea to eliminate wrong answers and be left with what could be correct, so that you can make a better educated guess at the end if needed. Okay, multiple choice strategies. So the main idea for multiple choice questions is making sure you get to look at every question. The timing doesn't seem very tight. There's 40 questions in an hour and a half, but some questions are going to take you 3 minutes and other questions are going to take you 10 seconds. So the level of difficulty of questions and the time needed for each question varies significantly. So I like to tell students, your first time through the test, don't spend more than 2.5 minutes per question. You want to see if you know how to do a question. If you can get the answer within 2.5 minutes, great. If not, you need to mark it and come back to it at the end, because you need to keep moving. So I like to have you make an educated guess, continue through to the end of the multiple choice questions, and then come back to any problem that's left. We also need to make sure we read the questions and answers very carefully, because they are worded in a way to trick you. It sometimes might say, why does this not work? And sometimes say, why does this work? Sometimes it'll say, which is the incorrect answer choice or which is the correct answer choice. So they're trying to trick you, and it's really important that you read through it slowly, circle or underline key words in the question that remind you what to look for in your answers. And then in your answer choices, as soon as you see something's wrong, like maybe a statement is missing a semicolon at the end, cross it off. That has to then be incorrect, and it can't be your answer choice. So paying very close attention to both the question and the answers. Monitoring your timing, we talked about that, staying within 2 to 3 minutes maximum per question. And if you have to come back, you can come back at the end, but you want to make sure you see every question. The multiple choice problems aren't in order from like easy to hard. They're a random mix. And of course, some students might find one problem harder than another student does. So try and keep your pace throughout all 40 problems. Mark questions that you guessed on, so that if you do have extra time by the time you finish 40, you can go back to the ones you made educated guesses on and try and get them more correct. Focus on eliminating answers. That again, just is the same thing. If you find an answer that is incorrect or a reasoning that is wrong, mark it off. There can't be a partially correct answer, right? If anything is wrong, it's wrong. So just pay attention when the answers are definitely wrong, cross it off, and make sure you don't fill that bubble in. Have an active pencil. So that basically means if you have a for loop, make sure you're writing down what each of the variables is iterating to. You don't want to have a silly math mistake by trying to do everything in your head. You have to write stuff down on this test. It doesn't work to do things in your head. So I like to write each variable and then the value that's assigned to it. As I loop through, I'll erase that value and change it to what it's become. So keeping an active pencil, underlining, circling stuff, writing your variables and their values down, super important. There's no penalty for guessing. We've said that before. So make sure that you have an answer for every single question. Don't leave any bubbles blank. And before you move on to the next question, fill in something on your bubble sheet so you don't accidentally get those bubbles shifted the wrong way. You get to question 40 and you're filling in 39. You don't want that to happen. So every time I make a guess and move past a problem, I fill it in my bubble sheet anyways. So that way, when I come back, I can find that specific question, erase it, and fill it back in. Checking for like errors in the code, the main ones that are going to come up are in your loops and with your arrays. You want to make sure you're always checking for an array out of bounds exception or a null pointer. Any runtime error is what they're going to be talking about. So making sure your for loop says I is less than string.length rather than I is less than or equal to string.length. Because when you get to that length, that character won't exist and you'll get a null pointer exception. Same with arrays. If you try to insert or change an item that doesn't exist, you're gonna get that array out of bounds exception. Another error that happens a lot is your return type or using the word private. Sometimes they'll try to access a method that's a private method for a different class. You need to make sure you're checking, are these methods they're trying to use public? If so, great. If they're private, then we have to figure out, is there a different way around this? Is there maybe a set that variable method, or is there a get that variable method? And then also checking if there's a super class for the class that they're working on. Did they use the super method correctly? And did they use the super constructor correctly? So knowing all your keywords and what's allowed with them or not allowed is very important. Free response strategies. So the free response questions are totally different from multiple choice. You can't just take an educated guess, right? You can't just bubble in a random answer and potentially get it correct. But there are certain things you can do. So for instance, finding the required parameters and return types, that's immediately some points that you get. So if it tells you to create a method that takes in an integer and returns a string, make sure you put return and then a string variable name. Make sure it says in the parentheses of the method header, int and then a variable name, because it's taking in an int. So paying close attention to the required parameters and the return types immediately gets you some points back on those questions. The next clue is to use the classes and methods given to you. Don't try to create something else, or if your teacher has you using one, like a different reader than scanner or anything like that, make sure you're using the classes that are given to you on that Java reference sheet. We want to make sure that you're going to get the points. They do give you that Java reference sheet on both the multiple choice and the free response. So if you have to and you don't remember which methods and classes you're supposed to know, they are on there. And then write clearly. you're going to be writing quickly because you only have an hour and a half for all these problems, but you don't want it to get sloppy. And if you have to insert something in, make it very clear where in your code you're adding a line, because if your line looks like it's below something else and it should have been above it, you won't get those points because your code's logic wouldn't quite work. Again, the free response questions are broken up into, like, did they have a for loop? Did they create a new array? Did they return the right type of thing? So getting those things in is important, but making sure the logic and the flow of your question, of your answer, is also just as important. Making sure your handwriting is clear so they know what you're saying and they don't have to guess. If they have to guess, they will mark it wrong because they're not allowed to guess. Okay, and then resources. So there's lots of different resources online. I like to go to the AP website for the free response questions. They have years worth of free response questions and their answers. So I go there, they give you the answers on the site, they give you the breakdown of the points. That's the best way to go about those free response questions. Get as much practice in as you can for free response. And then multiple choice, there are millions of multiple choice questions that could pop up, but finding as many practice tests as you can. I like the Barron's book. It has 3 to 6 practice tests depending on which version you buy, and they give answer explanations too. So if you're not going to meet with an ESM computer science tutor, you should definitely get a book or some version where you can see an answer and the explanation behind it, and you're not having to guess why something was right or wrong. And then the last site I really like is CodingBat. It's not specific to AP test questions, but it does have a lot of logic problems, a lot of array problems. So if there's a specific topic that you've been struggling on, those questions are on CodingBat and you're able to practice over and over again, and it'll tell you whether you're right or wrong and for what kind of input was right and what kind of output was wrong, that sort of stuff.